Robert Martinez was 62 years old and had been married to Susan for 35 years when the neurologist had sat them down in his office and had explained as gently as possible that Susan's increasing memory problems and confusion and personality changes over the past 18 months weren't normal aging, but rather were early-onset Alzheimer's disease, a progressive neurodegenerative condition that would gradually destroy her memory and cognitive function and personality until eventually she wouldn't recognize her own family or be able to care for herself. And Robert had sat there holding Susan's hand and feeling his entire understanding of their future together collapse because they'd planned to travel during retirement and spend time with their grandchildren and grow old together in the house they'd lived in for 28 years. But now the doctor was telling them that Susan would slowly disappear while still physically present, that the woman he'd loved for over 3 decades would gradually forget him and their children and everything they'd built together. Susan had been 58 years old at diagnosis, which the neurologist had explained was unusually young for Alzheimer's and meant the progression would likely be faster and more aggressive than the typical late-onset form of the disease. And within 6 months of diagnosis, Susan had already started forgetting recent conversations and getting confused about what day it was and losing track of familiar routes when driving. And Robert had retired early from his job as an automotive mechanic to stay home and care for her because she could no longer be left alone safely. Within a year, Susan had progressed to the point where she sometimes didn't recognize their adult children when they visited, would call Robert by her father's name, would forget that she'd already eaten breakfast, and would ask for it again 20 minutes later, and the neurologist had explained that this rapid progression was unfortunately typical of early-onset cases. Robert and Susan had 2 adult children, Michael, who was 33 and lived 3 hours away with his wife and 2 young daughters, and Elena, who was 30 and lived locally and visited twice weekly to help Robert with Susan's care. And both children had watched with helpless grief as their mother had gradually become a stranger who looked like her but didn't remember their childhood or their graduations or their weddings or the grandchildren she'd been so excited to meet. Elena had tried to show Susan photographs, hoping to trigger memories, had talked about family vacations and holidays and important moments from their shared past. But Susan had looked at the photos with polite confusion as though these were strangers' pictures, had listened to the stories with no recognition or emotional connection, and it had been devastating for Elena to realize that her mother no longer knew who she was. Robert had attended an Alzheimer's support group for caregivers where other spouses and adult children had shared their experiences and strategies for coping with the grief of watching someone slowly disappear, and many group members had talked about how the person they'd loved had eventually become someone completely different, how the disease had erased not just memories, but personality and emotional connections, how they'd found themselves caring for a stranger who wore their spouse's or parents' face. Robert had found the support group helpful for practical caregiving advice, but had struggled with the emotional reality that he was essentially grieving Susan's death while she was still alive, mourning the loss of their relationship and their future together, while simultaneously trying to care for her with patience and love, even though she increasingly didn't know who he was or why this strange man was in her house. 18 months after diagnosis, Susan had progressed to the point where she no longer recognized Robert at all, would sometimes become frightened or agitated when he tried to help her with basic tasks like bathing or dressing, because she didn't understand who this man was or why he was touching her. And the neurologist had recommended that Robert consider memory care placement because Susan's care needs were becoming too complex and physically demanding for one person to manage alone at home. Robert had visited several memory care facilities and had found them professionally run and well-staffed, but had felt sick at the idea of placing Susan in institutional care, where she'd be surrounded by strangers and wouldn't have the comfort of familiar surroundings, even if she couldn't remember what those surroundings meant. What Robert had noticed during this period was that even as Susan had forgotten everything and everyone else, she still responded to music in ways that nothing else could reach her, and specifically she responded to piano music from her childhood, songs that her mother had played on the family's upright piano when Susan was a little girl growing up in a small town in New Mexico. Susan's mother had been an accomplished amateur pianist who'd played classical pieces and old standards and popular songs from the 1940s and 50s, and Susan had grown up falling asleep to the sound of her mother playing Chopin nocturnes and Debussy preludes and Gershwin songs. And even now, when Susan couldn't remember Robert's name or recognize her own children or recall anything about her adult life, she would sometimes hum along when certain piano pieces played on the radio or would smile with an expression of peaceful contentment that had become increasingly rare as the disease had progressed. Robert had read articles and research studies about how music memory was often one of the last things to deteriorate in Alzheimer's patients, how the parts of the brain that processed and stored musical memories were different from the parts that stored other types of memories and were often preserved longer even as other cognitive functions failed, and how some patients who couldn't speak coherently or recognize family members could still sing along to songs from their youth or could play instruments they'd learned decades earlier. The articles had described music as a kind of doorway that could sometimes reach Alzheimer's patients when nothing else could, a way to connect with whatever fragments of self and memory remained buried beneath the disease's devastation. Robert had made a decision that had felt simultaneously desperate and absolutely necessary, which was that he would learn to play piano specifically so he could play for Susan the songs her mother had played, the pieces that still seemed to reach some deep part of her that the disease hadn't yet destroyed. Robert had never played any musical instrument in his life, had taken exactly 0 music lessons as a child or adult, had no particular musical talent or background beyond enjoying listening to classic rock and occasionally singing along badly to the radio. And at age 62, he was attempting to learn a complex skill that most people started learning as children. But he didn't care about the difficulty because this was the only thing he'd found that could still create moments of connection with his wife who no longer knew who he was. He'd bought a used upright piano from a family who was moving and had it delivered to their living room. And he'd hired a piano teacher named Margaret who was a retired music professor in her 70s who'd been teaching piano for 50 years and who'd been initially skeptical about taking on a complete beginner in his 60s, but had agreed after Robert had explained about Susan and the Alzheimer's and his desperate need to play the songs that still reached her. Margaret had warned him that learning piano as an older adult would be extremely difficult, that it would take years of dedicated practice to develop even basic competence, that his fingers would struggle with the coordination and his brain would struggle with reading music and playing hands together. But Robert had been undeterred and had asked Margaret to teach him the specific pieces that Susan's mother had played most frequently, starting with simpler pieces and working toward more complex ones. Robert had begun practicing piano 6 hours every single day, treating it with the intensity and dedication of someone preparing for a concert performance, even though his only audience would be his wife, who no longer knew his name. And the first few months had been brutally frustrating because his fingers wouldn't do what his brain wanted them to do, and reading music had felt like trying to decode a foreign language and coordinating his left and right hands to play different parts simultaneously had seemed nearly impossible. Margaret had been patient and encouraging, but had also been honest about how slow his progress was and how many years it would take him to play the more complex classical pieces that Susan's mother had specialized in. But Robert had persisted because he'd started playing the simple pieces he'd managed to learn for Susan and had seen her face light up with recognition and contentment in ways that nothing else achieved anymore. 3 months after starting piano lessons, Robert had learned to play a handful of simple pieces adequately enough that the melodies were recognizable, including Clair de Lune by Debussy, which had been one of Susan's mother's favorite pieces and which Susan had fallen asleep to countless times as a child. And when Robert had played it for Susan in their living room, she'd stopped her usual anxious pacing and had sat down on the couch and had smiled with an expression of pure peace and had started humming along with the melody. And for those 4 minutes while the music played, Susan had seemed somehow more present and less lost than she'd been in months. And Robert had cried while playing because this brief musical connection was the closest thing to having his wife back that he'd experienced since the diagnosis. He'd continued this routine daily, practicing for hours and then playing for Susan whatever pieces he'd managed to learn well enough to perform. And he'd gradually built a repertoire of about 15 songs that Susan's mother had played frequently, ranging from simple folk songs and hymns that Robert could manage with his limited skills to more complex classical pieces that took him months of intense practice to play even adequately. Susan's response to the music had been consistent and profound. She would calm immediately when Robert started playing, would sometimes hum or sing fragments of lyrics if the songs had words she'd known in childhood, would occasionally reach out and pat Robert's shoulder or hold his hand while he played, even though she didn't seem to know who he was or why he was playing for her. 6 months after starting piano, Robert had made the difficult decision to place Susan in a memory care facility because her care needs had become too physically demanding for him to manage alone at home. She'd become incontinent and needed assistance with all basic activities and would sometimes wander at night and had fallen twice, requiring emergency room visits. And Robert had accepted that he couldn't provide the level of care and supervision she needed despite his desperate desire to keep her at home. He'd chosen a memory care facility that allowed him to visit daily and that permitted him to bring a small electronic keyboard into Susan's room. And he'd established a routine of visiting every afternoon and playing piano for Susan for 30 to 45 minutes. And the memory care staff had told him that Susan was noticeably calmer and more content on days when he visited and played compared to days when he couldn't come. 1 year after starting piano lessons, Robert had progressed enough that he could play most of the pieces Susan's mother had played with reasonable competence, if not professional polish, and he'd added new pieces to his repertoire based on research about music from Susan's childhood and based on trial and error, observing which melodies seemed to reach her most effectively. The memory care facility had allowed Robert to bring in the upright piano from their house and had placed it in a common area where he could play for Susan and where other residents could also benefit from the music. And Robert had started playing not just for Susan, but for the entire memory care community. And staff had observed that multiple residents with advanced Alzheimer's who rarely engaged with anything would respond to Robert's playing with smiles or humming or decreased agitation. 18 months after diagnosis, Susan had progressed to late-stage Alzheimer's, where she was mostly nonverbal and needed total assistance with all activities of daily living, and spent most of her time either sleeping or sitting passively with little engagement with her surroundings. And the neurologist had told Robert that Susan would likely continue declining until eventually her body would forget how to perform basic functions like swallowing, and her immune system would weaken and she would probably die from pneumonia or another infection. And this brutal progression could take months or could take years, and there was no way to predict the timeline. Robert had asked the neurologist whether Susan was aware of anything or whether she was suffering or whether any part of his wife still existed beneath the disease's destruction, and the neurologist had said honestly that they didn't fully understand what Alzheimer's patients in late stages experienced or what remained of consciousness and selfhood, but that Robert's piano playing seemed to bring Susan whatever comfort and connection was still possible for her. 2 years after starting piano, Robert had become a genuinely skilled amateur pianist who could play complex classical pieces with emotional depth and technical proficiency that Margaret, his teacher, had told him was remarkable for someone who'd started learning in his 60s. And Robert had explained to Margaret that he'd had the most powerful motivation possible, which was being able to reach the person he loved who was otherwise completely lost to him. He'd continued his daily visits to the memory care facility and his daily piano sessions with Susan. And even as she declined to the point where she rarely opened her eyes or responded to anything, she would still sometimes smile very slightly when Robert played certain pieces, would still occasionally make soft humming sounds that matched the melody. And Robert had clung to these tiny responses as evidence that some fragment of Susan still existed somewhere beneath the disease's devastation. 3 years after diagnosis, Susan's condition had deteriorated to the point where she was bedridden and needed feeding tubes, and was experiencing frequent infections, and the neurologist and memory care staff had talked with Robert about hospice care and end-of-life planning. And Robert had understood intellectually that Susan was dying, but had struggled emotionally to accept that the final goodbye was approaching, because in some ways he'd already been grieving her loss for 3 years, and in other ways it felt impossible that she could actually die when he could still see her breathing and could still play piano for her, and sometimes see those faint smiles. The memory care facility had moved a small electronic keyboard into Susan's room so Robert could play at her bedside during what everyone understood were likely her final weeks or months. Robert had continued playing for Susan daily, sitting beside her bed and playing the pieces her mother had played for her 70 years earlier when Susan had been a child, falling asleep to Chopin and Debussy and Gershwin. And sometimes Susan would open her eyes slightly and would seem to look toward the music, even though Robert wasn't sure if she could actually see him or if she understood anything about where she was or what was happening. He'd played Clair de Lune for her almost every visit because that had always generated the strongest response. And he'd told her things he needed to say even though she couldn't respond or acknowledge anything he said. Had told her about their 35 years together and their children and grandchildren and the life they'd built. Had told her he loved her and thanked her for being his partner and told her it was okay to let go when she was ready. Susan had died on a quiet afternoon with Robert sitting beside her bed playing Clair de Lune on the small keyboard, and he'd noticed that her breathing had changed and had become shallower and slower, and he'd kept playing because he'd wanted the last thing she heard to be the music that had connected them when nothing else could, and she'd taken a final breath and had stopped breathing and had died peacefully with Debussy's notes filling the room. And Robert had finished playing the piece completely before stopping because it had felt important to finish the song for her even though she was gone. Robert Martinez's story reminds us that his wife Susan was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 58, and within 18 months didn't recognize him anymore, didn't know their children, couldn't remember anything about their 35 years together, but still responded to piano music from her childhood when her mother had played Chopin and Debussy as Susan fell asleep. And Robert, at 62 years old with zero musical background, learned to play piano practicing 6 hours daily for 3 years so he could play those songs and connect with whatever fragment of his wife still existed beneath the disease's devastation. Early-onset Alzheimer's affects people under 65, progresses faster than typical late-onset forms, destroys memory and personality while leaving the person physically alive but mentally gone. Susan forgot Robert completely, became frightened when he tried to help her because she didn't know who this strange man was. She forgot their children, their grandchildren, their entire shared life. Typical Alzheimer's progression: recent memories go first, then long-term memories, then language, then basic functions, then eventually the body forgets how to swallow or breathe. 3 to 9 years from diagnosis to death typically. But music memory persists longest. The parts of the brain processing music are different from parts storing other memories. Alzheimer's patients who can't speak or recognize family sometimes sing childhood songs perfectly, remember lyrics from 60 years ago. Susan couldn't remember Robert's name, but smiled when he played Clair de Lune, that her mother had played when Susan was a child in New Mexico in the 1950s. Robert had never touched a piano. At 62, he started lessons, practiced 6 hours daily, learned Debussy and Chopin and Gershwin. His teacher said his progress was remarkable, driven by love and desperation. 3 months in, he could play simple pieces. Susan would stop her anxious pacing, sit peacefully, hum along. Those 4 minutes of music were the only times Robert felt he still had his wife. 6 months later, Susan's care needs exceeded what Robert could manage. He placed her in memory care, the hardest decision. He visited daily with a keyboard, played 30 to 45 minutes. Staff said Susan was calmer, more content on days he played. Robert brought their upright piano to the facility, played in common areas. Other late-stage Alzheimer's residents who rarely engaged with anything responded to his music. 2 years after starting piano, Robert was genuinely skilled, remarkable for someone who started at 62. He played complex classical pieces with emotional depth. His motivation: reaching the person he loved who was otherwise completely lost. 3 years after diagnosis, Susan was bedridden, nonverbal, dying. Robert played at her bedside daily. She died peacefully one afternoon while he played Clair de Lune. The last thing she heard was music that had connected them when words and memory failed. Alzheimer's is cruel. It takes the person before it takes the body, leaves families grieving while their loved one still breathes. Robert grieved Susan's loss for 3 years while she was alive, then grieved her death. But music gave them connection when nothing else could. Those small smiles when he played, those hummed melodies, proof that some fragment of Susan remained beneath the disease. Learning piano at 62 wasn't about music. It was about love refusing to accept complete disconnection, about finding the one doorway that could still reach her. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe love finds ways to connect even when memory fails. Join the conversation. Have you or family experienced Alzheimer's or dementia? What helped you connect? Share below. Remember, Robert wasn't musical. He was desperate. He learned piano in his 60s because it was the only thing that reached his wife. Alzheimer's doesn't just affect patients, it devastates families. Caregivers need support. Support Alzheimer's research. Support caregiver resources. Support music therapy programs.